Hello, guys. Thank you for reconvening with us and for joining us for our final session of our jam-packed and super rich and generative and generous first day of panels. Thanks to our lovely panelists who we're so lucky to have, and we're so grateful for their contributions. For today, but also for the work that they've done before today as well. So this final panel is called Solidarity and its Discontents, and this will serve, kind of as the closing discussions to this first day of panels. And I hope that we can sort of thread through and continue some of the discussions that we've had earlier on today. So similar to how the other panels have been done, I'll start by introducing, the impetus of this panel, and then we'll have a moderated discussion with all the panelists, and then we'll open up the floor to a Q&A. And then we'll wrap up the rest of the day. And, tomorrow we'll meet again. We'll reconvene at the Brown Arts Center for the exhibition of Saad Al-Awad's work, as well as some of the films that we're showing by Sudanese directors. So before I start my introduction, I completely realized that I forgot to introduce myself to everybody here and everybody online. I think I want to sort of, I'll bridge away from, I guess, the intro that I gave in the beginning, because I want to sort of situate how I open this discussion in the personal. So my name is Bayan Abubakr, and I'm a sixth-year PhD student at Yale. My work is about the histories of racialization and the networks of capital in the 19th century Ottoman Egyptian Sudan. And I was raised between the US and Sudan, as well as Kuwait, but I feel like, my experience growing up in the US and in Sudan, and what I would say, like my experience growing up in two very different types of empire, has really shaped, my understanding of politics, my dreams of the future, and my aspirations for myself and for my community. That being said, I want to start with, discussing, a few months ago, when the encampment created by students of different American universities that directly invest in Israel and its genocidal campaigns in Palestine and occupied Lebanon took off, I felt very confused. And this is not because of their approach. In fact, as someone who took an active part in campaigning for BDS in my own university days, I never thought I would live to see the day when public perception on Palestine would shift so much. It took me a while to figure out what it was that was so confusing to me, and then I remembered. Looking at the photos and watching the videos of the encampments far away in a place where I could have never even dreamed about protesting, that place being Egypt, where I was doing my dissertation research, I swore I could feel the fervor of the encampments, the rage in every chant, and the determination of the protesters, no matter the scale of state violence pit against them through my phone screen. It all felt so familiar, and I couldn't remember why. Embarrassingly, it took me a very long time to figure out what it was that felt so familiar. And so when I graduated from undergrad in 2019, I went to Khartoum with my parents. We all wanted to see the sit-in that had been installed in front of the military headquarters on April 6, 2019, after the Al-Bashir government officially fell, but the military refused to hand over power to a civilian government. So I arrived to Khartoum at the end of May with my parents, and I spent almost every night of the next 2 weeks at the sit-in with them and my siblings. I was addicted to it, and I don't think I've ever experienced euphoria like that in my life. I first came, I think, to know, this is probably a heavy statement, but I think I first came to understand despair in Sudan when I lived there as a child. The Al-Bashir regime seemed like an inevitable permanent fixture of what Sudan was and how it had existed for generations. Excuse my naivete, I was only 15 at the time, and everything felt permanent. But the sit-in was the first time in my life that I felt a genuine sort of hope, genuine and deep, because right in front of me was something that I had never even imagined could actualize. And I saw that same hope reflected in everyone around me. In that space, I learned what community was, I learned what collective organizing was, and I learned what the cost of hope was. On June 3rd, 2019, the RSF and the SAF massacred scores of people at the sit-in in the early hours of that morning. The revolution was essentially aborted, and this was a process that would continue and be iterated through the 2021 coup, the constant marginalization of revolutionary civilian actors from the political process, up until the outbreak of the April 15th, 2023 war. Since then, I have been terrified of putting all my hopes in a future for Sudanese people, or people anywhere committed to remaking the world, that the world order and the militarized groups in and outside of Sudan it enables refuses to recognize. The sight of another sit-in, those being the encampments at these universities, scared me to my core. And I think, all Sudanese people know all too well the cost that is paid for the power of collective imagination. And I was afraid of, seeing that manifest again. So this brings me to my next point. Sudan, although it's often portrayed as being a place that is inundated by archaic or unmodern commitments to tribe and religion, represents the future, and in particular, the future and the failure of the current world order. And this has always been the case when it comes to understanding Sudan's history. When the Ottoman Egyptian government conquered Sudan in 1821, or more technically, it was the Fund Sultanate then, it was to experiment with new forms of militarization and resource extraction and to create an empire within an empire. When the Anglo-Egyptian forces took over Sudan in 1899, they created the largest irrigation project in the world that they imagined would maximize the potential of Sudan's underproductive lands. In 2018, the European Union launched the Khartoum process, which funneled 155 million euros worth of surveillance technologies, development, and aid to the rapid support forces, which had officially been incorporated into the military in 2017 to police Europe's borders from Sudan and make sure that migrants crossing into Libya from Sudan and Ethiopia would never reach Europe, even if it meant that they would be enslaved and killed while attempting to do so. Even today, the failure of the Sudanese state represents the failure of the modern world system and the nation-state model, which prioritizes the interests of a landed elite that exploits those dispossessed of their land and livelihood for the interests of global capitalist infrastructures. In my opinion, in my humble opinion, Sudan's present is the rest of the world's future, and I sincerely hope that people are paying attention. So in popular discourse, I see, many Sudanese activists and those invested in our struggle fighting to amplify public awareness about Sudan. And I have complete respect for these efforts and I laud them. Respectfully, however, I do not think that this should be our starting point. The rest of the world, I would argue, is paying attention to Sudan. The rest of the world depends on the failure of our state to maintain the machinery of global capitalism. Eyes are on Sudan and hands are directly tied to everything that is being extracted from it. I think what is needed and necessary to end our centering of the attention economies of disaster is an approach that centers the connections between different sites of disaster around the world and the global forces that perpetuate them. But with this too come more limitations and more contradictions that I hope to interrogate with our panelists. So, as we have discussed, throughout today, the counterrevolutionary war in Sudan is a global, regional, and local struggle. I'm wary, however, of the proxy war framing because then places like Sudan become a shorthand for talking about a global conflict that does not involve Sudanese people, even though Sudanese people pay the consequences for it. I think about how quickly the genocides in Yemen and Syria have been forgotten about in this framing of both sides as a regional proxy war, and I worry about the same thing happening to Sudan. So my question to our panelists is, how do we hold space for the global and the regional without losing sight of the local? And feel free to take up this very heavy and weighty question.
Can you?
I'm sorry, but can you repeat the question, please? Yeah, sorry.
Also, if I'm speaking very fast, please let me know. It's a bad habit of mine that I've been trying to unlearn for all my life, but I have lots of work to do. Anyway, so the question is, how do we hold space for the global and the regional without losing sight of the local?
I just want to make sure I understood you also correctly when you are talking about connecting Sudan to the global disasters, conflicts, and how those all apply to each other. Are you talking economically, politically, all?
I think materially is was where the focus lies. I think, when I talk about the attention economies, it seems that all of us who are, suffering from disaster, be it in Sudan, Palestine, Lebanon, Congo, so many sites around the world, it seems like we're almost pit against each other to have to compete for the world's attention. Yeah, there's a hierarchy of attention. And I find it's one, very counterproductive. I find it sad. I find it alienating. And I find it, it works against the impetus of solidarity. And also, as Lavuyo has whispered in my ear, it's also a deeply racialized process. We understand why, places like Sudan are ignored. There's a very specific reason for that being the case. It's internalized that, in African states, conflict and civil war and death and destruction are just things that are inevitable and also necessary for the rest of the world to function. And so I want us to step past away from sort of thinking about having to, talk about Sudan in relation to other conflicts because we're not getting as much as attention as them, but really sort of centering all of these conflicts, or centering the ties that bind these conflicts to one another, to really talk about the world system that perpetuates violence in all of these places. Yeah.
I'm not going to answer the whole question, but I think I have a really knotty relationship with the idea of attention and the sort of the challenge of the attention economy. And I think that's some useful phrasing. And I implicate myself in this, right? Because I'm somebody that has traditionally spent a lot of time kind of in the online and social media space talking about Sudan to a sort of public audience that is not engaged. And so it's really about raising awareness from a zero or even a deficit position. And also someone who's kind of engaged in the quote unquote mainstream media discourse around this as well. But I think that part of what the flag that it's raising for me is this question of why we think attention is important, right? And that comes from, my first instinct is to think that comes from a landscape where attention is monetized. It is directly linked to in the sort of data-based economy that we're in at the moment. It's directly linked to money and finance and profit and so on. So we do have a sense of attention being important, but I don't necessarily think the link between attention and actual change is necessary. I don't think it is true to say that simply because attention is being paid somewhere that will actually lead to any change, right? And I think the nature of the attention, the type of attention that is being who controls the framework and the boundaries and the context of that attention. And I'm thinking, for example, of when the war first began, there was, a lot of attention being paid to Sudan, but that was a very specific type of attention. And we weren't able to kind of pivot that into anything useful, right? Or it was very much still within the framework of, as you pointed out, we're pulling people out and of this really dangerous country, and this thing has, and then as soon as I think Sudanese actors were trying to, and activists and so on were trying to use this moment to kind of have a different type of conversation, the agency was not in their hands. And so I guess why I'm trying to problematize, for me personally, I've been trying to problematize my relationship to whether or not Sudan needs the attention of the quote unquote world, why we think we need it, what is it useful for, and is it about being a little bit more strategic with regards to what kind of attention we are demanding, and how we can actually use it. Because I do think attention for attention's sake carries its own dangers, and can mean that we're sort of focused on the route to an outcome as being the outcome itself, right? As seeing the attention as the outcome rather than the attention as a route to some sort of transformative change. That is just a seed to plant.
Just to pick up on what Yassmin said, I think the amount of times I've been asked why Sudan is a forgotten conflict, I think if I had a cent for every time I was asked that, I'd be a millionaire. And it's because the question is always, well, who's forgetting? Because I haven't forgotten, for sure. I don't think anybody in this room, many people in this room wouldn't have forgotten about Sudan because they engage with it every day. So the question of who is doing the forgetting or who's giving the attention is a very, very important one. And as we were saying earlier, Bayan, it's countries in the region who pay very close attention to what happens in Sudan have surely not forgotten Sudan at all. They're still very much engaged. So this is very sort of a Western-centric, view. Your average housewife in Idaho doesn't know what's happening in Sudan. I doubt she even knows where Sudan is. But the point is that she's somehow to be informed, but it's okay if everybody else. She's the person whose attention you're trying to get. And I don't think that's necessarily useful. And I find this particularly egregious when people in positions of power, people who are officials, say to me, oh, if only Sudan had the level of attention that Gaza had. And I'm just like, well, Gaza's in every single news program and it's back-to-back coverage. What have you guys done on that? Gaza has all the attention in the world. Has anything materially changed? And of course, they have no answer, but I think they didn't even understand it, because I think within their worlds, it's enough that you're on, sort of CNN and MSNBC and BBC and all sorts of things. That is the attention is the end. It's not the means to the end. And the relationship between, in other words, talking about global solidarity, between what is happening in Sudan and what is happening in Palestine is, to me, such a direct one. Because, for example, I was at the UN General Assembly 2 weeks ago. And for the last year, when I was there were no side events on Sudan whatsoever. And this is before October 7th, so no one can say it's any kind of comparison. It's simply because the UN didn't really invest in trying to get to grips with what was happening in Sudan, did not prioritize Sudan in any way. The Secretary General of the UN has not indicated that he prioritizes Sudan in any way, even though it is the world's largest hunger crisis, displacement crisis, protection crisis, humanitarian crisis, and we could go on. By magnitude, is the world's, sort of largest crisis. And so when, last year there were no side events, it was very weird. It was a very strange set of events. This year there were several events, most of them, if not all of them, high level, right? And it felt very strange to have that kind of, quote, attention, policy attention, not media attention, on Sudan. But I and others that were there immediately sort of concluded that actually people are talking about Sudan because they don't want to talk about Gaza. And the reason why that immediately felt very true is that everybody just talked about what was happening in Sudan and nobody committed to doing anything. It was just a talk shop. Nobody said, other than giving some money here and there for the humanitarian effort, which of course were drops in the ocean, nobody meaningfully committed to doing anything. Not on the humanitarian file, not on the hunger file, not on the protection file, nothing. So it just felt like this, theater, basically, that was being played out. And we came up with this term of humanitarian gaslighting, because we were sat there at a Saudi-sponsored, I kid you not, humanitarian event, co-hosted with OCHA, the Office of Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. And every country that has its hand in Sudan, whether it's the UAE, Egypt, the Qataris, the Saudis, whomever it is, and others, of course, the US, etc., they all, had a chance to speak, and they all waxed lyrical about how awful it was that Sudanese people were going through these things, and they all committed, a few million here and there, and that was that. And it was insane to me how they were giving the platform effectively to sort of whitewash their engagement in Sudan without any substantive engagement at all about how their direct interventions in Sudan, most of them bad, were playing out in real time. So, attention, great. But how we get that attention in the context of other things as well, other global priorities, who isn't in giving us that attention? These are all really, really important things in terms of, what we want for Sudan.
It's a really good question. I think I agree with everything that's been said so far. I think the nature of attention matters. I guess one of the first things I want to say is that I think, while the social media space is important, it's also a virtual space that's not real in a way. And so I've often felt like those of us who are organizing the diaspora, I think, need to be forming more coalitions with each other, at least if we're politically aligned. Because I think that is important. The politics, the political sort of alignment, and we need to be clear about our political sort of where we come together in order to be able to organize together. But to me, the work that's happening off social media to me is more important. I think it's, I don't know. And I think on the attention question, I don't do nearly as much media kind of interviews as Yassmin and Kholood do. I say no to most of them. But when I do, I get asked the question too, like, why is Sudan not getting enough attention? And we all know the answer. And lately, I've just been asking the even if it's live, I'll ask the reporter the question back and say, well, why do you think? Like, you are CBC Canada. Answer that question yourself, you know? Like, why are you asking me? So I think it's also sometimes like, it is, you know, it's a racist question. It's a, and even when we do get attention, I remember the New York Times did this story. I don't know if you all remember it was like about the famine in Sudan. And I actually, yes, like maybe a couple months ago, it was like starving, you know, images of starving children on the front page. And it really disturbed me, not because, I mean, I think the reporter, it's not his fault per se, but I think it was so decontextualized, right? And it really served, I think, to naturalize this war, to naturalize this famine, to potentially, you know, before the war broke out, I was writing a piece on David Beasley, actually, and on the connection between the kind of politics of hunger in the Horn of Africa and the politics of hunger in the United States, and the way that people were, you know, the Biden administration was rolling back food stamps, like COVID era food stamps, at the same time issuing these kind of billion-dollar bills, you know, that were meant to allow subsidized U.S. agribusiness to dump their excess wheat and corn onto Horn of Africa markets that were food insecure, right? To open up markets for themselves. And so I was trying to link the two, like to say that these things are all connected. So I think that kind of goes back to what you were saying, which is that, to me, working with the Sudan Solidarity Collective, we got a lot more requests after October 7th, right? The movement for a free Palestine has opened up the space, if anything, for people to want to know more and to know and to want to learn more about the connections between the two. As you mentioned, the kind of corporate actors that are engaged do sort of already connect the dots for us, and the Congo, I would say, as well. The question, of course, is to what degree have we been able to fill the information gap and the analysis gap of that, right? Do we have the capacity to, the contacts? And you know, so we've been experimenting in this. We've been working with the Palestinian youth movement, coordinating around kind of immigration policy issues, healthcare kind of initiatives, etc. Yeah, so I think, and going back to this kind of Gaza, I remember when the Geneva, when did it happen? August, yeah, okay. When I remember thinking this is part of the sort of prelude to the elections, right? Like they're trying to appear like they're caring about international issues. Gaza is obviously a mess, and they're you know, being called out for supporting the genocide. And they're trying to appear like they're doing something on Sudan. And as you said, Kholood, they weren't doing anything. And in fact, the conference probably cost more than what they pledged, I'm assuming. I think so.
They pledged 424 million.
Okay. Well, sorry. Okay, maybe not quite.
You know.
But you get the idea. Like, you know, they put more effort into gathering people than actually doing anything. And so I think there's a way that I think here too, we in the diaspora have to recognize that we're on our own. I don't think that calling for more intervention is in our favor at all. I've never felt that way. Even I've been doing this kind of solidarity work since the early 2000s. And yeah, I think for me, I sort of take inspiration from Haitian activists, sort of thinking about like, yeah, taking a more hands-off approach. I also think that our agenda, and I know this is not exactly what you asked, but needs to be more guided by people on the ground. Yeah, and I think we need to start drawing those connections. I have a piece coming out soon. It's like a speech that I gave at one of the encampments where the students asked me to connect Palestine and Sudan. And it was on June 3rd that they asked me to do that. So I kind of reflected on the sit-in and sort of compared university administrations to repressive states and so forth. And it was, I think for me, an important moment, because I do think that students organizing these encampments are wanting to make more of these transnational connections. Sometimes they don't have it's not necessarily information, but there is no sort of organized body necessarily that they can tap into. I think more of that is happening. But again, I think as a diaspora, we're quite fragmented and people are doing sometimes the same thing, but like in a way that isn't very coordinated. So yeah, so I think I feel like there's one more thing I want to say, but I'll get back to that later. Yeah.
Hamid, do you want to go first or?
No, happy for you to go first.
Yeah, sure. I actually don't have much to add to what's been mentioned. However, I think the way I look at it is slightly from a different angle, the issue of solidarity. Yeah, I agree with everything.
I'm sorry, Jawhratelkmal. We're just having trouble hearing you.
Yeah, I think every time I speak, I have to take my... Can you hear me now? Good. Yeah. I was saying that I don't have much actually to add to the discussion, but I think I do agree with much of what's been said. The way I look at the issue of solidarity is slightly different. It's true that there is the element of like the global kind of forces, the governments, the policymakers, and so on, which in my view is always like a diminishing kind of solidarity. Like there is a particular moment in time where famine was declared, we have all the attention, now it's gone. Previously, there was a particular moment in time where RSF troops were approaching Al-Fashir. Now that has disappeared, even though Al-Fashir is still besieged. And this kind of momentarily kind of moments of attention and so on. But the way I was looking at solidarity is actually different. I was looking at people-to-people kind of solidarity. And that's one thing I feel like we as Sudanese people haven't harvested enough. And that's my personal view. For example, the way we interact with regional issues in countries around us hasn't always been what I would describe as ideal. And I think this is also part of what of the discussion of our identity. For example, how many of us have been like following things in Central African Republic? How many of us have been connecting with civil society in Chad? How many of us have been following the South Sudanese war? And so on and so forth. Like we can go around all the countries and see that there haven't been much civil society to civil society connections or people to people connections and so on. Except in some cases whereby there was some ideological kind of alignment. For example, I understand that the issue of Palestine is very dear to the Sudanese people, but most of the time during the Inqaz regime, it was an ideological/political kind of mobilization around it because the regime was capitalizing on the cause and so on. So even when there were such things, it was mainly driven by political and other kind of incentives for the regime and so on. The other element also going back in history, I was briefly, I'm not an expert, I was briefly looking at documents from the Pan-African Congresses that took place in the early 1900s, and there wasn't much engagement from the Sudanese people, actually. Like that was surprising to me. I was looking like, where are the Sudanese people at the time, where so much of the continent was united around like the talks about independence and fight for independence and Pan-Africanism and so on, except for a few moments in history whereby there was like an alignment between John Garang, Museveni, when they were in Dar es Salaam and so on. So I think there is this disconnect from us as Sudanese people and the region around us, and this has reflected in the way the other countries also deal with the Sudanese case. Even though I've acknowledged earlier that the Sudanese civil society has accumulated lots of experience and knowledge, but we haven't managed to transcend that into the borders around us and at least get support. And of course, these countries are also are going through very difficult regimes, very difficult times, very difficult conditions, wars and everything else. But I think this is exactly why we need to connect, because we can't believe that the liberation of Sudan can be done without the liberation of South Sudan and so on and so forth. And so I think this is part of the issues that there was never this cross-border kind of connection or we never harvested on it and so on. And I think going forward, it's true that we need this global attention where we talk about media, the global fora and these kind of things, but we also need to look around in the region and see what resources we can tap into and how we can support each other in our collective kind of salvation, if I may say.
Okay, if I think I agree with most of what have been said, and I think I'm not going to provide answers, but going to add more questions rather from what I have been observing and experiencing lately. Particularly in terms of solidarity, and I think mostly on people-to-people solidarity, which I think is much more important from my perspective. And I think just to add to what Jawhar was saying, I think as Sudanese, citizens, we have had a very troubled history in terms of solidarity and transnational solidarity and relating to conflicts in the region because of specific ideological kind of opinions and views that were enforced and imposed on the Sudanese people by the regime of Omar al-Bashir and so on. But I think also it reflects, tribalist, racist issues within us. For instance, I was 13, I think, when, officials from the government would come to the school to force the administration of the school to send us to protests for Palestine, I think around 2004 or 5. When at the same time, that very government and that very regime was basically, carrying out a genocide in Darfur. And, we resonated, we, expressed solidarity and so on with Palestine when that very horrific situation was happening in Darfur, and there was no people. I'm from Khartoum. People in Khartoum. There was no acknowledgement of what was happening there. So I think just to say that we have this very troubled history in terms of solidarity with regional issues and so on, and that definitely affects how we view and experience and contribute to solidarity today. And I think also there is definitely a global hierarchy in terms of solidarity, in terms of which lives matter than more other lives, and which causes are more valuable and so on. And I think as activists or are people who kind of partake in solidarity movements and so on across the board, I think we need to start by acknowledging that. And I think without acknowledging it, we are not going to be able to meaningfully address it and so on. Because I have been in spaces where when you try to say, but there is definitely this hierarchy, it's so much. And obviously, this hierarchy, to be very frank, is racial, and the proximity to whiteness is in most cases what makes you more valuable. It makes your life more valuable, not only in terms of governments and regimes and so on, but also across people. And I think without acknowledging that, it's very difficult to move forward. But I think also what I have been experiencing, engaging in these transnational solidarity and trying to create these links between what's happening in Sudan and what's happening in Palestine and Congo and so on, is that often it ends up kind of reducing our thinking and analysis of, for instance, let's say from Sudan, in order to kind of for people to understand how it kind of links to what's happening in Palestine and so on. People end up understanding that the rapid support forces are colonizing parts of the country the same way, Israel is colonizing Palestine, and it reduces the analysis of what's happening in Sudan to that. And so I think the question that I have is, how do we create these links and make sure that we advocate for our causes collectively without reducing our individual or our specific narratives of Sudan or Palestine or Congo or Ethiopia and so on. And I've not seen that working well so far. I think also I definitely agree with a lot of what's been said in terms of how Sudanese activists need to, be more active in terms of establishing these links and create and providing this information and so on. But I think also what I have also been seeing is that we need to feel a lot this sense of solidarity reciprocated, because I go to events, for instance, that are advocating for Sudan, and in almost all these events, there would be space held, for instance, to speak about Palestine and what's happening in Gaza and so on. You don't see the same reciprocated in other events. So I think there is something that we all collectively need to do to acknowledge each other's suffering and to truly express our solidarity on equal terms, where all of our lives matter together, and where we acknowledge that the only way to liberation is our collective liberation, while also emphasizing that our individual causes matter on their own without having to be linked to a bigger issue, and so on. I'll stop here.
Thank you to all of you for your answers, because I think that you all sort of helped guide us to sort of thinking about the inherent contradiction and slipperiness and the danger of, I guess danger is a heavy word, but the danger of solidarity and like the role that it plays in universalizing certain struggles and erasing the particular experiences of, people and communities in Sudan who are subjected to a particular kind of racial violence. When we universalize certain struggles and we allow them to connect us to global struggles, which itself is an important project, it comes at the expense of sort of flattening the story of Sudan to fit into this like bigger narrative. And so that kind of leads me, if I can add on to Hamid's question to all of you guys, what is the role of solidarity? Who is this international community that we think of when we talk about an international community working for the favor of Sudan? What role does solidarity play in sort of getting us, past this stage that we're in? I'd be interested to hear you all ask this question in your respective works and your respective, in your work, with community organizations, with the so-called international community. Feel free to take it away.
Sure. It's what I love about moments like this is when I'm sort of not forced, but reminded to reflect on my own kind of assumptions and biases and practices and so on. Because as you said that, Bayan, I thought, when I say international community, I mean white international community. I mean Western European international community. I'm not thinking of the Horn of Africa as the international community. And isn't that interesting, right? What does that say about my own conception of who the world is, even as I'm trying to kind of challenge it? Well, I do live in London. Yeah, it is true. The metropole. Something that the things that came up as people were talking, and maybe to build on that question around solidarity and who it's for and so on, I find it personally challenging as somebody who's grown up in the diaspora, because and I've said this a couple of times already throughout the day, my relationship with Sudan has always been one that has been mediated by others, right? As much as I have, spent time living in Sudan, and I was born there, my experience is largely, through family members, through stories, through music and culture, through ideas, rather than having been a farmer or worked in, I've studied there for a short period of time. And so I'm often conflicted when it comes to the question of, where my role is in this question of solidarity. What is my stake in the idea of Sudan? Should I be sort of stepping back constantly? And the reason I bring this up is because I think when I think about solidarity, and when I think about my own discontents, when I think about being frustrated that Sudan can't be seen on its own, Sudan is always after Gaza, before Congo. People are like Palestine and Sudan and Congo. And I'm like, who decided that hierarchy? Why is it in this way? And then also sometimes people be like, and Yemen and Syria. And you're like, wait, what? How did this, why did it become this way? Also, all of these conflicts, the way in which they manifest are kind of completely different. And yes, they kind of exist within a world kind of system in order that we can definitely connect. And it's important that we connect, but also to what has already been said, the conflict in the Congo is materially different. And the ways in which that actually, I'm going to interrupt myself because Jawhara's point around how we as Sudanese people have also engaged with in our own region, I think, was also a reminder to myself for how much like a question as to why I personally am so wrapped up in this and not as wrapped up in the other conflicts, in the region. Why do I know less about, what's the protests in Kenya? And although I might have sort of done a little bit with Ethiopia and done a little bit with Congo, why I sort of, it can be positioned as a token kind of solidarity as opposed to like a genuine actual one. And what kind of solidarity is enough? For me, the point of it is, or for me, it is the most genuine when it seems to when it feels like my freedom is as important as yours, or your freedom is as important as mine. And really that idea of we're not free until we're all free is a sort of lived thing, right? It can't be just, talking about slogans. It can't just be this slogan, but what does it mean to actually believe that we're not free until we're all free? And how do we, especially us in the diaspora, how do we believe that and also live our lives, right? Because I find myself in the dilemma of sort of living a daily life that is separate to the wars that I spend my time intellectually thinking about, right? And that schism, I think, is one that brings its own tension into the work, I suppose. And sometimes I wonder if, the more noble thing would be to give myself up completely to whatever it is, the fight, but I'm also not sure that that's a decision I will actually make. And so I guess I'm sort of problematizing myself as much as answering the question. But I think that's, when I think of the discontents of solidarity, I think of what it asks of us. And I think of how often it is quite difficult to live up to our own ideals. And so what do we do with that gap? Thanks.
I think these are all really important questions that Yassmin has put forward, but who never ask themselves these questions? Dictators. Because they all scratch each other's backs and they all cover for each other and they have great solidarity amongst them. And they never have to worry about these things.
Dictator solidarity.
Case in point, just an example. 2 days ago, there was a vote at the Human Rights Council to extend the fact-finding mission, which is a mission to look into human rights abuses, war crimes, etc. in Sudan. Every country that voted no was an autocratic country that was worried about its own human rights record, but also didn't want to set a precedent, didn't want to be involved in setting precedents for these kinds of mechanisms. So this is how they game the system. Now, none of those, and there's a long list of 12 of them, none of those countries are going to think about any of the questions that Yassmin just asked. So I think we should also just be kinder to ourselves and say, if I can give a fraction of my time to this worthy cause, then that is enough, if that's what I can do, because I'm also dealing with displaced family and everything else, PTSD and whatever it is that's going on as well. I think we need to be much kinder to ourselves. Whatever we can give, I think, is enough. And it's useful to position, the people-to-people solidarity that Jawhara spoke about. That's really, really important because even in our region, if you think about what's happening in Egypt, what's happening in Libya, what's happening in Ethiopia, what's happening in Eritrea, South Sudan, every country that Sudan is around Sudan, all 7 of them, every single one of them, in those countries, the people in those countries are going through some of what we're going through. So it's not like even in our region, we're going through something particularly unique, although of course the sort of the intensity of it in Sudan is that much greater. So the people to people is really important. And you're right, oftentimes when we say the international community, we do mean, the West. We do mean, decision makers, policy makers, media houses in the West, how much political movements in the West, workers' unions in the West. But within the Horn of Africa, let's say, there are a lot of different groups, lawyers groups, civil society groups, women's groups that have created some of the foundations for some of that regional solidarity. Within the Arab world, it's much harder for obvious reasons. But I think the beginnings of that are there. The difficulty for us in Sudan is coming back to what we were talking about in earlier sessions is that we don't even have solidarity amongst ourselves oftentimes. And to Hamid's point about, being forced to protest for Gaza when the Darfur genocide was going on, I had a similar experience where I was, at a crossing in 2013 or something in Sudan. And there were these medical students, I think, because they were wearing lab coats, and they had these buckets and they were raising money. And I was like, oh, finally, there's some, maybe they're raising money for, Blue Nile or South Kordofan, which had just started sort of being in a new iteration of the war there. And as they got closer to me, I realized they were raising money for Syria. And I was just like, for God's sake. But at the same time, this inability to create a national solidarity is absolutely linked to the purposeful disruption of the creation of a national identity. And so we have to recognize what kind of pathways for solidarity are there so that we're actually able to go beyond solidarity once we've figured out where the missing gaps are. And that we need to first create a sense of, and this has happened at different points, including during the revolution, a sense of, a common agenda, a common national agenda. And from that, build a greater sense of solidarity that's actually practical, not just, sort of, I feel for you and I will champion your cause. And then we can really think about how to expand that. But I think maybe not and then. These things should happen at the same time. We have a lack of a national project. We need to build that at the same time as we build local and regional, axes of solidarity. And then also, yes, with the West as well, because I could rely on my networks in the Horn of Africa, but they can't do for me what my connections in the West can do, because they're much better resourced. They're able to oftentimes operate in a much safer environment. They're not necessarily always looking over their shoulders like they would be, let's say, in Ethiopia or Egypt. And so, using what's useful at any time, I think we shouldn't try to do a totality. We should try and just use whatever we've got at hand to try and build this thing as it flies.
Yeah, again, I think everybody's making some really important points. Okay, so I think for me, I do, as a academic, I guess, I get asked, as I've mentioned before, to talk a lot about Sudan, and I've been really careful about who I want to talk to, like who my audience is. I've been mostly talking to people who I want to be organizing with. I've been trying a little bit to sort of make a dent in the sort of Black left, because I don't know, those of you who are part of that know that around Ethiopia, also around Sudan, there's been some, things that need to be corrected, to put it lightly. And so, yeah, talk about, yeah. And similarly, I get as an academic to travel quite a bit, and I talk about Sudan outside of North America. And it's always interesting to me, the questions coming from Latin American folks, for example, are completely different. They're interested mostly in the resistance committees. They ask us in Chile, for example, there was this constitutional process, but participatory. There was, there's like conversations that we could be engaging in across the global South that I do think, like you said, there are, I think, linkages that we could be excavating more and building upon, right? Even in relation to the way the international community, quote unquote, the UN system, the are engaging with the rest of the world, right? So, yeah, and I think part of what I've also been thinking about is I have a very good friend who used to be part of Friends of the Congo, now is kind of doing his own thing. But, 10 years ago, I felt like he was playing the role that we are now playing to some degree. And so when, the Congo in the third place was coming up, he was just like, oh my God, it's like 28 years. Like, what do you all want to know at this stage, And we started talking a little bit about the potential of doing, what is going on? It's the surveillance state, I don't know.
Go ahead.
We started talking about potentially building a kind of boycott campaign around that links Sudan and the Congo. But then the complication comes in that every company you can imagine that we might like, computers, phones, is somehow involved in the Congo. So the strategy has to be very different from even, in relation to Sudan or in relation to Palestine. And so for me, it doesn't mean that we can't do something like that. I do think that if we think about 1968, the Columbia protests, right, against the Jim Crow, the gym that needed to, the sort of segregated gym in Morningside Heights. But then also there was a demand for the university to withdraw from kind of the military-industrial complex. In some ways, what the students are doing on our are doing on our campuses is demanding something very similar, right? It's to sort of divest from the military and prison industrial complex that is killing people. Like, let's just not invest tuition dollars in killing, right? Let's invest it in life. It's quite simple. And so I think there are certain ways in which we could be framing and doing research, right, that would allow us to identify some key targets that could unify a kind of, and I think students are interested in that. It's just more a matter of like, let's take our time in thinking carefully through these steps. I think part of what I've been seeing in the diaspora, and this is not to like shit talk anyone but is that sometimes we launch campaigns without fully thinking through the political implications and without then utilizing, like, we might go after a celebrity activist, a singer or something like that, right? And say, okay, have them talk about Sudan. How they talk about Sudan is important. How they then use that platform to potentially raise money for the ERRs is a lost opportunity if it doesn't happen, right? So again, like for me, I want us as a diaspora to take a step back, to be more deliberate in the way that we are moving, right? To coalition builds, but coalition building means building trust with people, and it takes years, right? And so like I can turn to my comrade who's from the Congo because I've been with him for like 10 plus years, and he can trust me enough to say, okay, let's think about this. If I didn't know him, it wouldn't have worked, right? And we're still moving very slowly. We're still, to me, the struggle is also like, is that really what people on the ground are asking for? Boycott, like those things are important as well. Secondly, I think when we're thinking about immigration policy, because that is one of the things that I've been surprised that we haven't, at least, I don't know, in Canada, we haven't been doing as much. Like, it's the biggest displacement crisis in the world. There is no country that has issued a refugee visa. Like, what is up with that, right? And it should be, there's the blueprint for it, exists for the Ukrainians, yeah. And so we could be, I think, people are mobilizing around it, but what they're not recognizing is that in the US, for example, the Black Alliance for Just Immigration, African Communities Together, the Black Immigration Network has been organizing around this for over a decade, right? And we could be, and they're actually advocating for Sudanese people. And so we could be plugging into that existing work rather than inventing our own kind of, because I think also the model of organizing in the circles that I travel in has been very sort of top down, right? It's like, let's meet these legislators as if they're really invested in, it's like, to me, it's about mobilizing in the community and building the pressure from the bottom up to say all Black refugees deserve asylum, right? In the same way that Ukrainians do, right? The Haitians are dealing with the same shit that the Sudanese people are dealing with. And I think until we start really building those connections in our organizing, things aren't really going to change, And then finally, I want to say the thing about Palestine. I mean, we all know that Palestine is being used as a symbol everywhere, including in the United States, I would say, but certainly in the Arab world in ways that have been very harmful, I think. And so I also want us to learn from that, not use Sudan as a symbol. Like I hear people being like, the genocide in Sudan, Palestine, and the Congo. Like the nuance is important. The genocide is not in the whole country, right? Like, and we need to be able to immediately check that, even if it's on social media, right? Because it gets translated into a South African comrade talking about the genocide in Sudan without, that, yeah. And it sort of, so anyway, I feel like I just was all over the place.
No, it was good. Nisrin, if I can, add to what you just said, which is really generous, and thank you for like bringing us to this point. I think it's also like part of what part of the tension that you're referring to. I think, our inability, or perhaps some of ours inability to be sort of pragmatic about political strategy over the long run is because so much of our reaction to the war and to violence in Sudan is like very reactionary. And I think that response comes from this idea that violence in Sudan is ephemeral and it happens in these small bursts, and it's almost decontextualized in the way that we understand it. The two civil wars that Sudan faced immediately after independence were their own thing. The genocide in Darfur was its own thing. The Al-Bashir regime was its own thing. The revolution was its own thing. The war is its own thing. When in fact, all of these things are interconnected and a fundamental part of how we understand like the political history of Sudan and also our future. Like all of these bursts of violence are connected to one another, and recognizing it as such, and sort of aligning our political strategies to a long-term vision that will get us out of this long history that we've suffered under for all of these years, I think is the only way forward. But part of that is also getting us away from just reacting to violence that occurs, but contextualizing violence in its long history and its prevalence and its necessity to the Sudanese state and the functioning of it. So thank you. Yeah, I want to sort of bridge this to go back to a question that was asked actually in the last panel, but I think will sort of tie everything really nicely. Jordan, if you could read it out loud.
This is by Vusi. I do not know if this was addressed to some point, but I'm curious to hear the panelists' thoughts on the incommensurability of Sudanese people suffering in politics, both in the Afro diaspora and among other oppressed peoples. I have in mind the incident by Palestinian photojournalist Motaz Aziza. I'm interested in perhaps what this commensurability or incommensurability means for global South resistance politics, Black transnational solidarity, etc.
Do you all know what the person is referring to when the aid came, migrants before Sudan, and then there was a joke that was made?
I'm sorry, we cannot hear you if you may.
Oh. Can you guys hear me? You guys hear me? I was just sort of contextualizing the comment made about the sort of the thing that went viral with Motaz Aziza, who is a Palestinian journalist, and there was an incident where aid from Egypt that was directed to Sudan was actually sent to Palestine, and so then Motaz made a joke about but we're not Black, so how did this aid come here? And then it went viral on social media, and people were really contending with, one, the question of how does somebody find time for anti-Blackness in the middle of a genocide ongoing, and also what, in fact, does this mean for transnational solidarity? So yeah, I just wanted to reference that in case people didn't know what the comment was referring to. But
I think my gut reaction is that is not to take our eye off the ball. Right? My gut reaction is to yes, okay, we can be upset in the moment, but to understand that the things that we are fighting are white supremacy, like broad structures that have been, that we are all kind of operating under. And that, of course, there will be lateral violence within the global South, because that is the nature of how empires and, systems of oppression operate. They find the fissures between communities and they exploit them, and they allow us to do the work for them, right? To turn against each other. So while that moment was, disappointing and not maybe surprising for any, Black Sudanese person that's had to engage with a lighter skinned Arab comrade, I think I guess part of it is how to not get too distracted, how to do the work that Hamid mentioned, which is, acknowledging the racism and the anti-Blackness that exists and the white supremacist racism, we have to be very clear, that exists within the global context that we're operating in, but not to let that distract us from kind of like the broader work of being in solidarity within the global South. And I loved what you were saying, Nisrin, around the kind of questions that you get from, comrades in Latin America, for example, because I often think that, the similarities between, Caribbean and Latin American movements, for liberationary movements, and are ones that we can learn from, and yet we don't often look, I think, anyway, from the Sudanese context, I'm not often looking across, but actually that's what we could be doing more of. There's a part of me that really wants to resist. I feel like there's an ease that comes with, being like Sudan's lives don't matter, right? Because I think that is true, but I also don't want to fall into that trap. I think there's something comfortable in in that narrative that I just am a bit wary of. I don't know I feel like it's letting someone off the hook. I don't know who it's letting off the hook, but I feel like, I'm sort of responding to the question of commensurability of, like, I'm not even sure that is why do I have to enter a conversation thinking about like the value of our lives against each other? I just don't like that framing, right? And I think once we start with comparing the values of lives, we've lost the argument. That is not the argument, right? And I think maybe that's I'm always kind of thinking about what is the starting point, and so kind of revisiting the starting point, which is we all care for each other. We all want the conditions to live full, free, lives. What is the best way forward to that? And if somebody's asking, hey, do you think that person's life matters more than yours? I'm like, that's the wrong question, right? Why are you asking me that question? What do you get out of asking me that question, making me think about my life versus their life, rather than, what does it mean for us to kind of band together?
On that note, because you mentioned it, you whispered it to me. So I'm curious, following this line of questioning about asymmetrical valuation of lives. I don't actually think that it often plays out or is expressed as explicitly in that way. I'm thinking about the activist Angela Davis, when speaking about Palestine, calling it the litmus test for humanity. So I think that there's a way in which people are often performing solidarity that they believe is, in fact, including or making larger the tent of universal humanity, if that's what we are after, while at the very same time perpetuating and reinforcing the racialized ladder that being included into the universal notion of humanity already implies, right? Totally. That if you have a litmus test for humanity, it always seems to be one that occurs outside of the continent of Africa. And so I'm curious about how, again, these asymmetrical valuations often exist within the guise of solidarity, or often exist within the guise of a more collective or universal revolutionary, let's say, politics.
I love that question. And if I may jump, did you want to add something? No. To me, that the reason I'm smiling is because I'm like, it's such a reminder that Angela Davis is American. You know what I mean? Because to me, I think that is such a very specific U.S. kind of statement to make, right? A U.S.-centric statement to make. I mean, like, I think the quote unquote question of Palestine has a particular resonance and complicity within the sort of foreign policy of the United States, and so I can see how one might make that statement as a Black American and see it as a particular liberationary one, where it might not actually play that way in any other context at all whatsoever. I think also what I would add to that is that when I think about solidarity, and I think about, for example, Palestine, Gaza, and other movements where that valuation question comes up, it is often, I mean, and this is a generalization, but I think it is the case that often it's not actually the people from that place that are making the value judgment. Like, I'm not having this problem with other Palestinians, right? I'm having the problem with the people who have taken on Palestine as a symbol, right? And I think that is interesting, because I think that's actually not about the conflict itself or not about the solidarity itself, but it is about what it has become, what it has seen to represent, the fact that it is a litmus test, quote unquote, et cetera, et cetera. And so, then kind of bringing it back down to the grassroots, to the actual people, I think that's where I find I sort of am soothed in some way, because I'm like, oh, when it comes down to it, we get each other, but it's the noise, it's the story, and yes, that is important, but that's actually like a different strata to what that's kind of that is a question of narrative, perhaps. Just some thoughts. Anyone? Sorry, people on the Hamid or Jawhara, do you want to add anything?
Yes, so I mean, I think I remember, maybe it was like late October. People are going out to protests around Palestine, and one of my students gave a speech about Sudan. And this ammu came from the back and was like, "Why are you talking about Gaza? Why are you talking about Sudan? This is a distraction. We should just be focused on Palestine." And she was shaking. This indigenous contingent kind of formed a circle around her, and then she continued speaking, in tears. And I remember we talked about this as a collective. And part of, I think, what happens is that, especially I think actually in relation to Palestine, at least in the Arab and Muslim community, obviously not, exclusive, whatever. You know what I'm talking about. I don't have to explain that part. Okay. I think that there is a way that people have through their mosque or through their families come to Palestine from a fairly narrow sort of political education and analysis and organizing experience that includes, for example, the same ammus going to the what is it? The anti-trans marches, right? So it's I think, and this is similar in a way, in the sense that I think we do have a lot of work to do in our own community, in the Sudanese community too. Whenever I bring up homophobia, transphobia, I don't identify as a straight person. It's really, challenging for people to kind of engage with, because they have narrowly come to this from a particular place and perspective, and because they have rarely organized in coalition before, right? And so I think this is partly what people have to recognize. I mean, again, this is also the sort of perfect victim issue, but that if we're going to start effectively organizing, political education needs to be part of that. That ammu should have been, and he was probably not even Palestinian, to be honest. I mean, I don't know where he was from, but he needed to be, the mosque that he probably came up in, right, is a conservative space. It's a reactionary space. It's a transphobic, homophobic space. It's a, whatever. It's against. It's probably whatever other policies against homeless people. They're there's other issues there, and so I think that is why it's important when you're organizing at the local level to engage in political education before actually starting campaigns, so that the ammu doesn't show up and do that. So that he can, and even if he does, so that somebody can call him in a way that it doesn't continue, right? And again, I mean, we obviously can't control people who come to the protest, but that's one point. And then the second part I wanted to say is, I think this thing about, I often hesitate to bring up Ukraine because I think it does put us in this trap of sort of having to humanize ourselves, right? And having to say, don't we matter too? We are way beyond that question. We should not ever be talking about that. I don't want to have to, talk to Mark Miller or whatever the equivalent is in the US now. I don't even remember the Department of Homeland Security, right? Whoever we're advocating for, about whether or not my life matters, the lives of my family members matter, et cetera. And so on that note, I mean, this is maybe a little bit wacky, but I think I remember we were at this meeting, the South African ambassador, I think, was there, the Cuban ambassador, and the Palestinian ambassador. This is Canada, not the US, so just so you know. That's why the Cuban delegation was there. Right? And this was the same week that Hamid had gone to South Africa, but the ICJ ruling, so we were challenging him a little. Actually, my Jamaican friend was challenging the South African ambassador on this. And he just diplomatically walked his way around that, right? And sort of, pointed to, because at the time, Kenya, Abiy in Ethiopia, they were all sort of doing the same thing, basically. And in the case of Kenya and Ethiopia, it was also the UAE was giving out loans, etc. So there was all this happening. And I remember thinking, this is the sort of neoliberal evolution of the revolutionary struggle, right? And that I think, yes, to Jawhara's point, I think there does need to be more people-to-people solidarity across the African continent. As you'll note, it's if you want to fly from Khartoum, and my partner is from Burkina Faso, right? If I want to fly to see his family, I have to fly to Paris to get there, right? And that is obviously purposeful. And they have been I think, what was this? I think my friend Zakaria Mampali, who wrote this book, African Uprisings, very good book, wrote about this. There were 90 uprisings that happened over, several decades on the African continent, none of which really made the news in any significant way. But you did have Burkina Faso, Zimbabwe, all these places rising up, Ethiopia before the Tigray, what happened in Tigray, right? The Tigray genocide. All of these places were rising up, and yet, for the most part, certainly people in my family were not talking about them. They were talking about Palestine, maybe Syria, but not. And I remember bringing this up at an NYU event during the revolution, and someone was like, well, we don't speak Swahili or whatever, so why would we be? Because I was I think we need an orientation towards the African continent, right? People was kind of were saying what do you know, diaspora person who hasn't lived in Sudan? But it's true, right? We do. I think we need to educate ourselves more about our, other parts of certainly the countries that neighbor us, but also make connections between struggles. And every place, in the Congo, for example, there's Lucha. I've been on panels with them. They're doing amazing work that is actually very similar to what the resistance committees are doing. In Burkina Faso, there are groups that are doing work that is actually very similar to the resistance committees, even if the context is very different, even if their strategies are very different. There is a way that I think people could be more in conversation, and something could emerge from that, including there's this Colombian now, a relatively progressive Colombian government. And, part of, and I've become friends, somebody who was an academic has now become the UN, whatever, ambassador to Colombia. And part of me wonders, why not advocate for them to, I don't know, give some, support to Sudan or open up their borders? We don't have to only kind of be directed at, Euro-America when it comes to some of our demands, especially if they're the leftist governments, right? I think, again, speaking as a reluctant anarchist, I'm not too invested in that. But if there is any kind of advocacy, perhaps we should think about that,
There's a question for you, Nisrin, if whoever you don't mind reading that.
This question is for you because you mentioned racial capitalism and Pan-Africanism as useful frameworks earlier. I'm curious what you think, having referenced Cedric Robinson, about Black studies, Black radical imagination, and liberation work intersecting with this moment around framing the global political imagination. How much coalition building do you think could happen there, perhaps in the realm of the symbolic, per Sylvia Winter's use? And I guess I'm thinking a little bit between this panel and the previous panel where there was a conversation around narrative making. That's a big question. That's the question, yeah. And I also would probably want to hear more about speaking of Cedric Robinson, the Black leftist, Black Marxist overdetermination of what we think of as Black radical imagination. Mm-hmm. Because you did just mention you were an anarchist, a reluctant one. So it would be interesting to put that in the conversation too.
Wait, that last part, are you talking about the sort of the Black left's misinterpretation?
Yes.
That part, okay.
Yes.
Okay, so let me start with that. Again, safe space, Well, Well, I mean, I think, and my sort of Horn of Africa scholar friends talk about this a lot. I think we have to look at Ethiopia as a Black empire, right? And as doing kind of its own form of empire making within, hence what happened in Tigray. And I think the Black left has for a very long time, under the guise of Pan-Africanism, embraced this kind of, Ethiopia, like united Ethiopia kind of idea that is actually quite violent, right? In similar ways, actually, to, the Sudanese state, and it's certainly ideologically. And so I think that's one thing that, again, I think I've been having a hard time figuring out how to push back. But I think it's important to engage with that kind of community and group of people. Okay, on the other question, the racial capitalism question to me, Cedric Robinson's own work is actually very expansive. It's not provincial at all. And it refers more to, in fact, it does actually point to sort of processes of racialization and kind of, the ways that racism enshrines capitalism, the ways that kind of racialized forms of exploitation and extraction, allow kind of the capitalist system to reproduce itself, et cetera. And I think what's happened, though, is since the resurgence of interest in his work, there's been a bit of a provincialization of like that framework onto the sort of Atlantic world, if you will, that very much leaves out places like Sudan that are impacted by not only European forms of imperialism, but also non-European forms of imperialism and empire making and so forth. And like slavery, for example, as well. And I think that is something that I think, there are scholars like Ibrahim Nugud, even Muhammad Salah, like different people who have been talking about this very thing that I just mentioned, right? And these processes without necessarily using the term racial capitalism. And so, so I think that's one thing. What was the other part, the Sylvia Winter part?
Narrative, and the pretty much the function of narrative and
sort of imagination.
Yeah, and imagination.
Yeah. I think, again, part of what the revolution did for me is it shifted my own thinking around time, right? And the sort of tempo of resistance and revolution, because as it evolved, it slowed down, right? Necessarily when you move beyond protest and the revolution kind of, if we think of it as this protracted process, the tempo slows down and it becomes much more about a deliberate kind of consensus building process that is messy, that is necessarily in some ways contradictory as well, that because you're trying to sort of force different viewpoints into something new, and that's always a very difficult process. Anyone who's done kind of local organizing knows that, and it comes with its discontents. And so for me, that temporality is something that I have tried to inhabit more. Like I've been trying to slow down more and to think, to reflect, to read, to educate myself more before taking any action, And for me, in the past, and I'll just speak to myself, I feel like as a diaspora person, I've taken up too much space, both in terms of providing analysis of what's happening, but also in terms of providing solutions. And I've stopped providing solutions because I think I'm not going to be the head or whatever. There is no head of the revolution, but I'm not going to be leading no one into the revolution in Sudan because I don't even live there. It's not my role. And this is, the Sudan Solidarity Collective has mostly been about material support to local people. And it's also in our communication with them been about how do we take their knowledge, their analysis, and ground our organizing in a kind of partnership with them, right? That is guided by them. And that often means shrinking our role rather than expanding it. And that can be sometimes, I think, difficult for people to kind of, internalize. So I think, so that's one. And then I think this final point I'll make, and I feel like I've talked too much, I'm sorry, but is that I crossed the border, when I left Sudan in late April of last year, with a ton of privilege. I had a newly acquired U.S. passport. My parents barely got out because they don't have a U.S. passport. And the Saudis are the ones who took, allowed us to get out, etc. But it became very, very clear to me. I remember when the Saudis were calling out, they called all the European countries first. And then I remember they were mocking the African countries. They were like, Botswana, and like making fun of the names and stuff like that. And I had to actually go around and like call the people from those countries to come in. Anyway, there was a total hierarchy of nationality and who got out and who didn't. And it was very, very clear to me. So that was that one. And then at the same time, the ships that were coming in to take us out had nothing on them. And that was a moment where people weren't yet obstructing aid. They could have been full of food and medicines and all kinds of things because the supply chains had completely collapsed. And so in that moment, to me, the border, the port, had become a real sort of real life manifestation of the violence of these borders, right? And so for me, my imagination now includes getting rid of that. And I know it sounds like when I talk to my students about it, it sounds completely, I don't know, insane perhaps, but I don't see how we can survive with this current border system. It's only going to get worse, especially with the climate crisis. And I think that is also one thing that Sudan is showing us, is that we cannot live and thrive under this current system of borders and states by extension, right? So I'll just end there. Yeah.
Sorry, I was just reflecting on all that you said, and I think you kind of summed up perfectly that it's not only, important. I think, through this panel, we've all sort of like thought through what it means to see the world through Sudan and what it means to engage with the world through Sudan. But I think, Nisrin, especially as you sort of brought us back to the original point I was trying to make with the introduction of like Sudan in many ways represents the future of the world, the end of the world. And this violence that you talk about manifesting on the border, I actually remember reading your tweets as you were leaving to Saudi, and like only 2 weeks later, I had such a different experience myself where the Saudis point blank said that no Sudanese person of any passport was going to enter, was going to take the boats back to Saudi Arabia because the UN had just come with 50 buses and, all of the NGO staff that had been stationed in Sudan were the priority. And they very clearly said that. And never in my life had I ever thought that it was possible for a state to enact such violence so callously and also so openly. But then it all just became free reign. So I think, it's not enough to just see the world through Sudan and, acknowledge Sudan as like the future that all of us are heading to. To your point of, it being almost this bold claim to say that we can remake the world and borders, like these nation states are only 100 or so years old. That we used to live in a world where the divine right of kings controlled everything we did, and capitalism itself like really only started going, maybe Cedric Robinson would argue with me, say that it came from the 14th century, but as a system that we know it now, it really was from like the 18th century onward. So it's like the world can be remade, and it's like I think our responsibility as Sudanese people, I see it as a responsibility now, is that we've seen what the end can look like it'll end in destruction and fire and the worst of what we can imagine. Like, I mean, I can only speak for myself, but the things that, I saw in Sudan those last few days before I left during the war were things that I never thought I would see in any lifetime. Things that I didn't think were possible. And so I feel this responsibility now to sort of warn the rest of the world of what is to come, because I don't think Sudan is at all an aberration or something that is random or just will happen to us, but the rest of the world too will be subsumed under, through this. And I don't think that the U.S. or even places that we look towards, the so-called international community that we look for, that we look towards for support and for aid and for all of these things, I don't think that they're far away from this either, that the U.S. is not far away from this future either. So I want to thank you all for your contributions to this panel, and I very reluctantly have to close it just because we're all getting shuffled out of here. But I mean, thank you all so much for your offerings today, for Hamid and Jawhara for persisting with the time zone difference. Thank you for all of the contributors to the Q&A. Thank you for all our participants in person. Thank you for all of our panelists who will be joining us tomorrow, and to our supporters who made this possible. And thank you again to my co-conveners, Lavoyo and Jordan and Daniel and Kristen for making this all possible. And I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow, inshallah.
And thank you, Bayan, as well.